continue the streaming.
Yeah, and then I'll do the streaming. So before we start the class, Gurudev, is there anything you want to share? Or just
No, I think we'll just discuss the person and contribution of Puri Maharaja on the day of his Tirobhava, the day of his disappearance today. Tirobhava is, of course, thought to be auspicious in some way, I guess you could say, in much as separation is said to make the heart grow fonder. And Sanatana Goswami in his Brihad Bhagavatamrita seems to have tipped the scales in favor of separation, which is interesting insight of his. And so the disappearance day of a great saint and Acharya in our particular line, Pujapad Bhakti Sridhara Goswami Maharaj, we were gathered together to honor his contribution. And of course, as you know, I was through his blessing and grace after the disappearance of Prabhupada. I had the fortune of coming under his guidance, and he asked me to start something, a mission, and carry out what Prabhupada would have expected of me, given the circumstances and so forth. And he advised me that he would be in the background, energizing, if you will, and there to consult with. That was quite a long time ago, relatively speaking, probably around 1985. And he departed from the world a few years after that, 87, 88, I can't recall exactly the year. I was in San Francisco at the time when I heard of his departure. But in a few years that I had his good company directly, I had the opportunity to consult with him at considerably and to hear his talks and so forth. And of course, he was very generous, very kind to me. And I met him, I guess you could say, in the Paramahamsa phase of his life. At that time, he was quite old. He was, I think, a year or two older than Prabhupada, and he was not expecting to outlive Prabhupada, who was traveling around the world with this a lot of energy and enthusiasm, recruiting and so forth, and opening temples and publishing books. And then in the meantime, Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was living comparatively in solitude, and he was probably about 80% blind, and his health was not good. He was more or less constrained to his veranda. He had an L-shaped veranda around a small room where which was his bedroom, and he used to sit in those days that I was in his company, which was, of course, after the departure of Prabhupada, when some of his disciples came under the guidance of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. He used to sit on his veranda in the mornings, sometimes for a couple of hours, and in the evenings as well, to discuss with us, enthused by our enthusiasm, and brought out, so to speak, by it. And as he saw that, the extended, we were the fulfillment, our enthusiasm of the aspiration of Prabhupada to fulfill a mandate, if you will, a suggestion to him, imparted by Bhaktisiddhanta, that he bring Sridhar Maharaj out. So he liked to think that even in Prabhupada's absence, he was still fulfilling the desires of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and that one in particular, in relation to ourselves. So there we were, a few of us, a handful of us, in his good company, and bringing some new persons to him, initiating some new persons as well under his guidance. And as I say, he was a couple of years, maybe a year or two older than Prabhupada. Didn't expect to be in that position, given Prabhupada's apparent good health comparatively, and the fact that he was widely traveling and very, very active. So he was quite surprised that Prabhupada departed before him, and then kind of rose to the occasion, if you will, of the difficulties with succession in ISKCON, and the fact that a number of Prabhupada's disciples, as I say, myself included, came to under his guidance, where we were forced to make a choice, as most of you know, either to follow the leadership of ISKCON at the time, or to adhere to the good insights of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. So of course we chose the latter. But this was, again, the more or less the Paramahamsa stage of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, who was active earlier in his life in preaching, but never to the extent that we see in Prabhupada, because he was more of an introverted person. Prabhupada was a much more outgoing. Prabhupada had a little bit of a mercantile disposition mixed in with his Brahminical and of course overarching Vaishnav, I'm speaking, but within the context of that, Brahminical sensibilities. And Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was more, he didn't seem to have that that mercantile side to himself, but more kind of purely Brahminical temperament. And more, as I say, more introverted. Prabhupada was more extroverted, and I'm just speaking about their natures, if you will, aside from the way that they were empowered to do what they did. But earlier, as I'm saying, in his life, before I met him, he of course was engaged in preaching, recruiting, and so forth under the direction of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He was involved in the Kurukshetra Math of Gaudiya Math's many monasteries, and Madras Math, and so forth. But even anyway, in the context of that, he was the introverted person in the group. But his introversion also, if you will, lent to also some outreach, in the sense that it was channeled into writing. And this is something that I think is relatively unique to the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Obviously, Prabhupada wrote, but Prabhupada wrote mostly commentaries. He once said that his only book was, after that I think he did some other ones, but teachings of Lord Chaitanya he wrote himself, or he had some little books. I think he said that about teachings of Lord Chaitanya, which although it is an original book, it follows very, very closely the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He had some original smaller books, but they were more outreach type of books, Journey to Other Planets and so on and so forth. And further, again, amongst other disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, we don't see so much in the way of original contributions through writing. And what I mean by that is that in Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj's introverted nature, which was channeled into some writing, there was very much originality in there, original thought, if you will. I think that was one of the things that characterized him, made him stand out in the minds of even other godbrothers of himself. When I speak about his originality with regard to writing, I refer to works like his Prapanna Jivanamrita, where he goes through the angas of Sharanagati and draws verses from the larger canon, Gaudiya canon, that demonstrate those angas. And more so, I would say, in terms of his works like his commentary on the Brahma Gayatri. That's a very original work. And when I'm speaking of original works here, I'm speaking of things like the contributions of the Goswamis themselves, the founding acharyas. They were original works, original ideas, if you will. So we find that in probably this is one of the better examples, I would say, his commentary on Brahma Gayatri, which brings the import of Brahma Gayatri not only to, as Jiva Goswami did, insightfully and with originality, to its import to be a petitioning of solely and exclusively properly understood Sri Krishna, because there are many ideas about what the Gayatri represents, means, what its import is, and so forth. And both in the Paramatma Sandarbha and a little bit in the Tattva Sandarbha, I believe maybe in the Krishna Sandarbha as well, Jiva Goswami explores the Brahma Gayatri, which is said to be in the Garuda Purana which the Bhagavatam, I should say, is said to be a commentary upon. So Jiva Goswami sought to bring that point out, demonstrate that, if you will. So Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj took us there and further in the context of Brahma Gayatri to Radha Dasyam, explaining grammatically the implications of the words of the Gayatri mantra, Devasya, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Satyam Param Dhimahi. So Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi. Devasya means Krishna, playful Krishna, and Bhargo means light. So who sheds light on he who is said to be the light of lights, if you will. But most of you are probably familiar with that work. If not, I would highly recommend you familiarize yourself with that. It is a really good example of what I'm referring to, this quality of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, his originality, which is hard to find. Most people don't have original thoughts. That's not necessarily bad. And that's true amongst devotees and even amongst gurus, teachers. Mostly we find a faithful transmission of the teachings, perhaps with some insight according to time, hopefully, with a time and circumstance and so forth. But if we make the comparison, as I am, between some of the writings of Pujya Srila Maharaj that demonstrate his originality to that of the Goswamis, then you can understand the difference that I am pointing out. So we find that in him. I think it is a very prominent quality of his, and one that was noticed by his peers, and brought him, without the pursuance of it on his part, a great deal of respect on the part of his godbrothers. You may know, most of you may be, I should say, may be familiar with the Sanskrit stanza that he wrote, in which he captured to a large extent Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. What is it? What's the name of it? Pranamami Shada Prabhupada. But at any rate, that's the refrain. I want to say there's another poem that he wrote, and I want to come to that to some extent, in which about Bhakti Vinod Thakur, about which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said he has captured Bhakti Vinod, is captured in this poetry of Sridhara Maharaj. Was quite a compliment. But before going into that, which hopefully we will, with regard to his prayer, famous prayer glorifying Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, I don't think Bhaktisiddhanta was to say that he himself was captured there, and I don't know if it was written after the disappearance of Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta, which is probably the case. But the point I'm making is that universally, his godbrothers, his peers, without saying it, perhaps, illustrated the fact that they felt that Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was captured in the poetry of Pujyapada Sridhara Maharaj. And to give you an example of what I'm speaking about, my Guru Maharaj, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, at one time in Vrindavan, at the Krishna Balaram Mandir, where he once expressed a desire to have 25 sannyasis residing there full time, taking care of Krishna and Balaram, just to give you an idea of how he felt about Krishna and Balaram, and the Krishna Balaram Mandir, what it meant to him in Vrindavan. I don't think any temple that he manifested, that came about as a result of his campaign, was as important to him, as dear to him, as the Krishna Balaram temple in Vrindavan. It was quite a astounding accomplishment, I think he felt on his part, to go from Vrindavan everywhere and open temples and bring in new devotees and so forth is no small task. That there's a statement by Jiva Goswami in his Sandarbhas that he repeats at the onset of each of his 6 essays, Sat Sandarbha, and that is where he glorifies Rupa and Sanatan, whom he says are glorious in Mathura, in the mandal of Mathura. So it's one thing to be a glorious devotee, but to be glorious in Vrindavan itself, to be recognized in Vrindavan itself, that is really an accomplishment, if you will. Someone may be known all over the world as a devotee, but even Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was going to Vrindavan, Sanatan said, you should go without a big crowd behind you. there was a political reason for that, and there was a spiritual reason behind that as well. Basically, obviously, Krishna is big in Vrindavan, and his entourage is big in Vrindavan. The two are one and different. So to come in touch with Krishna is to come in touch with Radha, to come in touch with Nanda, Yashoda, Subal, Sridham, Raktak, Patrak, all these associates and so forth that are manifestations of his own internal Shakti. And there's no meaning to Krishna being the friend unless he has friends. Therefore, Mitram Sanatanam, as the Bhagavatam says about those friends. So Sanatana advised Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to go quietly into Vrindavan as a mendicant. And of course, he's big in Vrindavan, and he got noticed for his bhakti and so forth. But my point is to be determined to be a great devotee by the Vrindavan sector, like Sanatana Goswami, who it's been described that as he wandered throughout the Braj and would come from the forest into a village, all the village people would come, the children would come, and all, and affectionately express their regard for him and so forth, in all ways, both just in the ordinary sense and in terms of his spirituality, for those who are spiritually astute, if you will. I've described before in the day just past of the Guru Purnima, which coincides with Sanatana Goswami's Tirobhava. He used to keep a shaved head, which I was meaning to do today, but I didn't get the time. And as such, he was sometimes referred to as Munda Baba, shaved-headed Baba. And it's said that when he disappeared from Vrindavan, all the people of Braj, men, women, and children shaved their heads as a way of saying, demonstrating their allegiance to him, the elder of the Goswami. So Jiva Goswami says, to them, I offer my respects, Rupa and Sanatana, who are famous as devotees in Vrindavan. That's a huge accomplishment. And through the worldwide preaching of Prabhupada, obviously he became well known. But when the Krishna Balaram temple was established in Vrindavan, then the road from the Delhi, the road that goes to Delhi, there's a turnoff that comes into Vrindavan. It was renamed Bhaktivedanta Marg. So the path into Vrindavan went through Prabhupada. So he was a hometown boy. He considered that his home, Vrindavan, and his temple of Krishna Balaram was accepted there, and so forth. So it was a big accomplishment for him. And I'm getting a little bit off on a tangent, but forgive me. But at that temple, he once expressed a desire, and I think he did it in writing, that he wanted 25 sannyasis, residents there, living, to take care of Krishna and Balaram. So you can imagine what the temple meant to him. Anyway, at that temple, when Akhoyananda Maharaj was the president, he asked Akhoyananda Maharaj to sing this song written by Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, that it should be sung every day in the temple. That song, that's a Sanskrit stotram in which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is captured. And I'm saying that he was captured in there in the original writing of Sanskrit writing of composition of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, because of the extent to which his peers felt that was the case. So this is an example I'm giving of Prabhupada feeling that to be the case. He said, not only should it be sung here every day, but in all of my temples all over the world, it should be sung every day. It's one of the things, unfortunately, that didn't come to pass. And there are a number of things like that Prabhupada expressed in earnest to one disciple of another in a leading capacity somewhere that didn't play out. I say it's unfortunate because I think that Prabhupada was a little bit tight-lipped in speaking about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, because when he did, he would weep. And he had such high regard for him. Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj was, and he knew him a little bit more from a distance. Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj was in the mission and more closely associated on a daily basis with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. We heard a little bit more about him and his character from Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj. And in this poem, as I'm saying, this Sanskrit composition, he captured Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And not only is evidence for this from what Prabhupada had said, but the spirit that Prabhupada he expressed about this poem was shared by all of the godbrothers of Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj. And thus, that song is sung in every branch of Gaudiya Math every day. And in some of the branches, a verse or two have been selected and inscribed in marble. So that's quite an endorsement, if you will, as I say, from one's peers as to the extent, in this case, Sridhar Maharaj's peers, the extent to which he was able to capture in their minds what they felt was the person and the contribution of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And he did it, as they say, in Sanskrit, which was not something that a large number of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's disciples were proficient in. So he was a very scholarly Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj. I think his scholarly nature made him a little bit more introverted, as I'm saying. But the nature of his introverted nature being channeled, as it was to some extent through these compositions that I'm speaking about, in turn had an effect of reaching out at the same time. So while he didn't have a penchant or a disposition for going here, there, and everywhere, as you know, he was very reluctant, most of you may know, to accept disciples after the disappearance of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur and after different factions of the disciples of Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta had chosen a course in terms of how to proceed with the mission and expand the number of disciples. He removed himself, as was characteristic of him, to the background, and sought residence in Navadvip, for which he went to Ek Chakra and begged the permission of Nitai Chand, who gave the impression to him within his heart that you asked me for your mercy, but you don't give your mercy to anyone. So he thought from that I have got the blessing, I could stay here, but I can't keep entirely to myself. And so if people come to me, then I'll have to give them shelter, but I'm not going to run here, there, and everywhere to capture them. So this was a good quality of his, and it is partly, as I say, his disposition, his nature, being introverted, being scholarly, Brahminical, and also, of course, in terms of his capacity to move in the internal landscape of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and have standing in the depth of insight and realization as to what Vaishnavism is. While he had originality, as I'm saying, as one of his qualities, and very and he was internal and introverted comparatively in his nature. At the same time, there's a very much of a universality to his person, and that comes across very clearly in the way of his thinking about things in general and about Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And I personally found that to be very refreshing, insightful and uplifting. The originality, one thing, but but at the same time, the depth of his insight, and at the same time, the universality. They might not seem to go ostensibly to go together, but in one sense they do, because the deeper that you are able to go within, the more introspective you are, the more you're going to be able to draw from the world around you and see it in that light, and then speak about your internality, if you will, your inner insight, drawing upon the world around you. So he was very capable of doing that. There was a very profound sense of universality, which we find in Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was very prolific, and he seemed to be outgoing also in nature, comparatively speaking, and he was acquainted with Western philosophy and theology, and he would bring that out to some extent in his writing. And he coined the term Saragrahi Vaishnava, an essence-seeking Vaishnava, which, in his own words, caused him to see the deity in another church or a mosque or a temple outside of his own tradition as the same God that he worshipped, who was being worshipped differently here by persons of different, that a different connection, if you will, with the absolute. So his universality it was expressed in that way. It very much comes out, of course, in his speech on the Bhagavad, famous speech. It's very electrifying to hear that. And this was this universality of Bhaktivinoda Thakur that I'm speaking about, which we find in Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj as well, was something that it was obviously very compelling to the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had the task of taking the insights and aspirations of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and spreading them, circulating them widely. And he was able to capture young men and women from Hindu society who were educated and to some extent, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was able to do so because he was presenting the universality of Bhaktivinoda that took Gaudiya Vaishnavism outside of the book, or showed how the book is but in all the texts is kind of but an outline, if you will, or a table of contents to a book about the nature of the absolute. That's important. If you look at the Goswami's work as an outline or as a table of contents, obviously there's a lot more to it, but it all follows from the outline, all follows from the table of contents and so forth. But there's a tendency to think that the absolute is contained, within the book, and that committing to memory some verses and philosophical insights is tantamount to becoming Krishna conscious. And of course, it should be helpful in that regard, but the two are not entirely the same. And that Gaudiya Vaishnavism at the time of Bhaktivinoda was a little stagnant if you compare it to the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and maybe a century or two afterwards. It was quite alive and well. At the time of Bhaktivinoda, it wasn't very much respected by the secular society or the Hindu society at large. So I think that among other things, there are a number of reasons for that, but among other things, the inability to take the text and universalize it, if you will, in terms of time and circumstance. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur did this, and his Bhagavad speech is very electrifying in that regard. Where he goes so far as to say no book is perfect. And he brings out relativity in the Bhagavatam and so forth. So this universality was very much a characteristic of Bhakti Sridhara Goswami Maharaj. I mentioned relativity. It's packed into the Goswami's own original teachings, the fact that scripture is full of relativity, which is not something that many disciples of Gaudiya Vaishnavism today think about. I don't think. It's not my experience. What I mean by that, of course, is that Jiva Goswami in his Tattva Sandarbha, beginning of his first of his 6 treatises, he makes it clear that in his effort, which is a successful effort, to place a focus on the Srimad Bhagavatam as and identify it as the hub, if you will, around which the sacred texts are orbiting, and in relation to which, in context, they be properly understood. This is very, really original thinking. I mean, and core insight into Gaudiya Vaishnavism, to place the Bhagavatam where he does, as it says itself. It is the what is the verse? Pramanam amalam, pramanam amalam, paramahamsa samhitam, Srimad Bhagavatam. So it is the spotless Purana, the spotless Pramana form of evidence, that from which you can comprehend as much as you can through it, the things that you couldn't know otherwise, the nature of Bhagwan in particular. So, the point I'm making is that in his Tattva Sandarbha, he says, well, the Shiva Purana and the Padma Purana and the Vishnu Purana and the Brahma Purana and this Purana and that Purana, these are all written with a view to minister to persons affected primarily by one mode of nature or another, whether it be Sattva Guna, the Vishnu Purana, Padma Purana, or the Shiva Purana, the Tamaguna, and so on, the Brahma Purana, the mode of passion, and so forth. So looking at the text from a certain angle and speaking about it such that it will appeal to those under those influences. This obviously speaks about relativity within the scripture. It's common today. I've seen someone finds an old book and quotes it, this Purana, that Purana, and takes some quote and thinks because it's written there, therefore it's Gaudiya Siddhanta. That's not how we arrive at Gaudiya Siddhanta. And this is one of the ways, as I'm speaking, we have to find the relativity in the scripture. So Bhaktivinoda alludes to this in his Bhagavad speech, and also in his Krishna Samhita and other works, even Jaiva Dharma and so forth. And this is very bold, to make this statement. I mean, it's true, it's obvious in one sense once you understand what they're saying. But you find this also in Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, and he was very quick to point out this idea of relativity within the Guru, within Guru Tattva. I mean, it's one thing to say relativity within Shastra. Shastra says the Guru is absolute, and then you have to find relativity within the Guru, who speaks according to time and circumstance, which means relative. It is what he says would be somewhat relative and more pertinent to time and circumstance spoken than at other times. Not that there is not a current throughout the Acharyas speaking, writing, whatnot, that will be relevant in all time and circumstance. But at the time, in the circumstances in which the talk is given, in which the writing is given, there is going to be something that is addressed that is not going to be there in the future. And the talk was relative to that and so forth, just to give an example. And of course, gurus have different dispositions, they have different likes and dislikes, and so on and so forth. And we have to distinguish that from the absolute position of representing the teaching and so forth. So he was also quick to bring out this point of relativity. I remember when he first was speaking about that, and we were trying to pass that along to some of our God brothers and God sisters who are still members of ISKCON. Boy, that went over like a lead balloon. That was like not very popular or well understood, or as it started to be understood by some, they'd say, well, how do we decide what's absolute and what's relative? This is giving me a headache. Yeah, you have to have a headache to make progress in Krishna consciousness. That you have to strain your intellect also. It has to be taxed. You have to exercise it according to the measure of it. Doesn't have to be big, but you have some, and it has to be taxed, like your body. The blood has to be given for Krishna consciousness. Your mind, your intellect as well. So, and of course, in the company of Pujyapat Sridhara Maharaj, I had the opportunity to grow very much my spiritual intellect, because, in a sense, Prabhupada told me what to think, and Sridhar Maharaj taught me more how to think about what to think. I think overall the Guru is meant to teach us how to think more than what to think, but he has to tell us to some extent what to think. And not that Prabhupada didn't teach me how to think, he did, but Pujyapat Sridhar Maharaj taught me how to think about the things that Prabhupada invested within me, within all of us. He sought to teach that. That was very refreshing, and I felt my spiritual intellect grow exponentially. Just by the contact with him, and then he, of course, and hearing his words and so forth, it was like an upgrade or something. And it tapped into something that I had, of course, and gave me a license to use it, which I've really taken considerable advantage of, and it makes me a bit under myself, I guess, in many respects. Of course, happy in the company of all of you who identify with my way of thinking, but it comes from these sources. So in Pujyapat Sridhar Maharaj, we also find the universality and original thinking, universality. Universality, I'm speaking of in terms of, in one way here, thinking outside of the book, or demonstrating how the book goes beyond the book, if you will, that it's an ongoing book. And I think that one of the other ways in which we experience that universality in the person of Pujyapat Sridhar Maharaj was his references to Western luminaries, thinkers, Hegel, Bishop Berkeley, Hegel with Die to Live, and Bishop Berkeley's, what would you call that? He was a idealism. Of course, our idealism doesn't do away with the world altogether. There is an objective world, but we're more lean towards idealism than towards objectivism, if you will. That the world is there, but it's not what it appears to be. It's not an illusion that it doesn't exist at all, but it's illusory in the way it presents itself, showing different faces at different times, and so on and so forth. So to hear about core concepts of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and how they have to some extent, they are found in original thinkers like Berkeley, like Thoreau, or like Hegel, Die to Live. It was a phrase apparently of Hegel's that Pujapad Sri Maharaj drew upon. So he was acquainted with these Western thinkers and philosophers, a very educated person. And then to hear him speak about Gaudiya Vaishnavism and draw upon them is an example of what I'm saying with regard to universality being a quality. We have originality, universality also part of his person. And it's interesting, as I said earlier, that it seems to be in contrast to being an introvert. But if you introvert spiritually, then you come out, so to speak, on the other side in the way that you think, and whatever you hear, you draw upon it in such a way as to further bring out your inner insights and so forth. So he was very much a kind of a universalist in the sense in which I'm speaking about it, and very poetic also in his speeches. And these qualities are they're not that common to be found. And as I was saying earlier, I think that as much as Bhakti Vinod was represented by the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, it's what caused a lot of young people to join. It's not that they didn't know about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and it's not just the power and the person of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, but it's the universality that that Bhakti Vinod Thakur expressed with regard to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, that took it from being kind of literal into something living and so forth, that could draw in persons who in Bengal who grew up around Gaudiya Vaishnavism but weren't captivated by it, if you will. So we find this quality also in Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. These are two that I wanted to speak a little bit about. Again, his originality, many Sanskrit compositions. I don't know of any other prominent disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur that has any original Sanskrit compositions. There may be some, but I'm not aware of them. And the ones that Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj penned were well respected by his peers, and they have currency outside of that particular sect, that particular line that we come in as well. As I said, his text, Prapana Jivanamrita on Sharanagati, his Brahma Gayatri commentary. He spoke about, I don't know if he wrote about it, but his Rig Veda mantra, Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Param. This is also very original and insightful on his part. Again, to the universality, we go, I guess we could say, further to the poem that he wrote about Bhakti Vinod Thakur in the presence of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur while he was still amongst them, about which the Saraswati Thakur, as I mentioned earlier, said Bhakti Vinod Thakur had been captured in this poetry of Sridhar Maharaj. So we get a really deep connection to Thakur Bhakti Vinod in this regard, in the person of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. And we're all very fortunate to be gathered on this occasion to think about, to discuss his qualities, his contribution. He was very very generous in general. He another quality of his was very strong common sense. Very strong common sense, and as a result of that, he was someone like Rup Sanatan, who common people would go to settle a dispute, and how they weighed in on it, it would be accepted. So Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj had very strong common sense that made him a person who others and other devotees and even God brothers would approach for his common sense insight on an issue that who would weigh in. It was a very strong quality of his, and it was very refreshing. It made him very very like living and open, if you will, to possibilities, ways of looking at things from different angles and so forth. It is also an evidence of very, very strong faith, deep faith. Once he said that he had very late in his life, he said he had a dream, and in his dream, all of his shastric knowledge was taken away, and he had only his shraddha, only his faith to stand on. And that faith was very, very deep. And one of the evidences of the depth of his faith is that he could entertain other ideas, conflicting ideas, competing ideas, welcome them, if you will. Because, as you know, there's an English adage, weak faith requires an enemy. So if my faith is weak and it's not based on its deep standing and experience. I mean, what could make our faith stronger than experience of what Gaudiya Vaishnavism is in terms of its the emotional, trans-psychological emotions that it gives rise to. We experience this as abhas, an abhas of that bhava, or as we keep on more advanced, bhava itself per se. But to have even consistent experience of an abhas of bhava, this is nothing could be more confirming to us than that. This is one of the reasons that a lot of Prabhupada's disciples are so committed to him, regardless of what he says, because in his company they had some strong experience, and so they're going with that, if you will. Now they need to think about that experience, reflect on it, and so forth. I think to understand it in context, and not become sectarian in their thinking, but nothing, my point is, could be more confirming than inner experience, and faith that's based on that is strong. It's not dependent upon a particular scriptural idea or way of thinking about the scripture that I've become accustomed to, which may be correct, it may not be correct, or when I say correct, may not be entirely supported, let's say, by Jiva Goswami, and some people have imbibed, for example, the idea that we fell from Vaikuntha, to use a crude example, and then they learn, well, that's not exactly the teaching for hundreds of years, and that's not how it's presented by the founding acharyas of the Sampradaya, and so forth. And because their faith and standing is dependent upon certain ideas that they've come to be acquainted with, rather than experience, they find this to be something they have to fight against. They don't invite the discussion, so to speak. They close it down when the book, Not Even the Leaves Fall from Vaikuntha is published, for example, which was in 1995 when this was a big controversy in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. That book came from within the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, penned by Satyanarayana Das Babaji, who was a member at that time, a teacher in the Gurukul in Vrindavan, ISKCON Gurukul, ISKCON Krishna Balaram, ISKCON Gurukul. They banned the book before anybody could read it. So this is this is not like a discussion and inviting competing ideas and so forth. And maybe they're right, and maybe we go with it. This is a sign, as I say, of strong faith, the depth of faith. We find this in Pujapad Sridhara Maharaj. It goes along with his common sense and his openness and the extent to which his thinking was very full of gray matter rather than black and white. And that was very liberating, if you will. Prabhupada had a way of presenting things in black and white. I think he was empowered to do that. It was very helpful. When I joined the mission of Prabhupada, it was very helpful to have things like, it's like this and it's not like that, because the sea of quasi-spirituality in which many of us were circulating, it had no anchor. There was nothing to hold on to, so to speak, that would then be of use in terms of then practicing. Like you to give an example of what I'm talking about, when we were building Aldaria here, there was a fellow from Norway who was a builder who was the main contractor, and he had a quasi-spiritual kind of perspective, still in the sea as I compared it of such that many of us came out of and came to Prabhupada from. Found an island, there, something to hold on to. He was quick always to tell me that sadhana is the last snare of Maya. Of course, he was doing no sadhana of any kind. So it's like, okay, Prabhupada would say no. That there may be some truth to that idea. You could get caught in, if you want to think about the implications of it, which I don't think that fellow did, but it's an interesting thought. But just throw it out there when you don't have any sadhana to begin with. Let's wait for the last snare of Maya, if it is. Let's get out of the other ones first and do some sadhana. Then worry to see if we get caught up in book learning. Let's say, for example, rather than taking the books and using the head, as I often say, it's often hard. So, Pujapad Sridhara Maharaj, we found this also very strong common sense was a characteristic of his, and he was very his faith was very deep. So he didn't have any enemies, so to speak. He would welcome other thoughts, reflect on them. He wouldn't agree with them all, but obviously. And so I also found this very refreshing. And as I say, to conclude, I don't want to go on. I've talked for, I think, over time now, but I'll conclude with the fact again that he was very, very kind to me personally. He asked me to start a mission. I did. I brought my first disciples that I initiated there to him. And when I was there, it was during the Gaur Purnima, and the day of my birth is the day before Gaur Purnima. So somebody said today is Tripurari Maharaj's birthday. So he said, oh, there should be a ceremony, and so forth. And he encouraged that, and so on. To my embarrassment, he, he referred to me as a bona fide student. And when he said that, one of his students, Hari Charan, who had been a brahmachari for his whole life in the month, his eyes became very wide. And so a measured remark like that on the part of Sridhar Maharaj was something that, whatever he said, to say, oh, he's a good student, you know, you would not take much from that, you know, that's nice. But his eye went wide, like Puri Maharaja says, he's a very a bona fide student, I think he said something like that. That was like a huge, I'm not trying to glorify myself here, but just to bring out something about Pujapati Sridhar. That was a huge compliment. This statement was, somebody else would have made it, you wouldn't have made much of it. But if Sridhar Maharaj thought it and verbalized it, whoa, that was something to take notice of. It reminds me of something that once Giriraj Maharaj, a godbrother of mine, who had been hearing from Narayana Maharaj and was repeating some of the things that he heard that Narayana Maharaj was talking about, and those things were then being further shared, and apparently it was causing some confusion on the parts of some devotees. And so he asked me, how is it that Pujapati Sridhar Maharaj was able to talk about higher things without this confusion? And I told him, I said, well, Sridhar Maharaj didn't talk that much about higher things. We talked about the lower things in the highest way. We did hear from him about Manjari Bhav, something that you won't find probably in the Veda base. You probably won't find the term Veda base as a collection of Prabhupada's writings and talks and so forth in digital form. You'd be lucky to find the word Manjari in there at all. It wasn't something that Prabhupada focused on or talked about, really. Comparatively, you can find a lot of things that he spoke about with regard to Sattarasa, but even that wasn't focused much on the Prayojan Tattva. So, you know, this did come out in the talks of Pujapati Sridhar Maharaj, and it was very refreshing, but it was very tasteful the way he did that. But mostly, as I replied to the Maharaj, he spoke about the lowest things in the highest ways. Everything he said had such depth and far-reaching implications. That was my experience. Very kind to me. He asked me to do what I'm doing here today, and with your help, hopefully I can do it better. Thank you very much. Bhakti Rakshak Sridhara, Swami Maharaj, Tirobhava, Mahamodsabatiti. We are over time, but I will entertain, because it's a special occasion, any questions or comments, if anyone has any that they would like to share. I see there's a lot of things in the chat. Maybe there are some questions there. Existe una declaración de Jesús. Sí. We have a question. The question is about the sacred geometry of Goloka as explained in Brahma Samhita. To be fair, it's a little off topic. Let us see first if there are any other questions or comments regarding the topic at hand.
Guru Maharaj?
Yes, Padmanabh Maharaj.
I would like to ask you, if possible, if you could share some thoughts about how you, as a disciple of Srila Sridhar Maharaj, deal with the topic that sometimes apparently he has said things like bhakti being inherent in the jiva, or jivas falling from the tatastha shakti origin. So how you, as his student, have accommodated those notions to present the Siddhantas you present to us, in which way you harmonize apparently contradictory statement from your own Siksha Guru. If you could share that to us as a way for us to know how to deal with that as well.
When you'd find it in me, then you'll have to do it also. That's maybe there. Yes. Well, who are those illustrious devotees at your side there?
Here, Guru Maharaj in Mother Mohan's house in Brighton. There's Mother Mohan. Here's Mohini.
Mother Mohan, of course, I know.
You have
Mohini.
Sukhi Krishna Prabhu
Sukhi Krishna
Nrsimha
Prabhu ki jai.
and Nrsimha Ballava Prabhu, who is joining us also.
Nrsimha Ballava ki jai. Nice to be with you all. So, yes, that's an interesting question, relevant to the topic. Overall, I would say that it's been very clear to me that Prabhupada and Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, my gurus, that they felt that it was important that what was taught was representative of the previous acharyas, the founding acharyas. And I think that they very much underscored this point. And if I'm to take that seriously, then I have to take that when it applies to whatever they say as well. That's their teaching to me. It's possible that they may say something or have written something that, as you say, it differs, does not correspond with what the founding acharyas have said, which founding acharyas are giving what Gaudiya Vaishnavism is. I mean, that is basically an interpretation of the sacred texts that many people in many different sampradayas, lineages draw from and draw differently from to come up with their own lineage, obviously. So what the Goswamis have done is thus very important for us, comparatively to contemporary acharyas. They're not doing the same thing. Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj gave an example of this. He said, the Goswamis took gems, stones, and drilled holes in them. And they left it to us just to put a thread through them, to make a garland of them. So they drew Nana Shastra Vicharanayakani Puno Sadharma Samstapako Lokanam Hitakarano Tribhuvane Manyo Sharanakaro. Srinivasa Acharya describes it. They drew from the sacred texts widely, so many verses, and then they drilled those gems of verses. What is the implication of them? They're basically drawing on Narada's insight shared with Vyas, that you have to come out with something that in no uncertain terms emphasizes the position of bhakti in terms of its slavific power, its power to deliver us. That, of course, is the ultimate work of Vyas, Srimad Bhagavatam. So the Goswamis are drawing on that, right? And from the Bhagavatam and other texts and so forth, and constructing Bhakti Shastras, all supplementary to this idea of what the Bhagavatam is, an emphasis in no uncertain terms on the efficacy of bhakti, and how it supersedes any other method for bringing a solution to the problem of material existence. Not only it brings a solution by way of bringing a positive possibility, potential that is extraordinary, prem prayojan and so forth. So what the Goswamis did, you have to distinguish that from what contemporary acharyas do. The contemporary acharyas are meant to draw upon their work, as Prabhupada repeatedly said, as Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj said, as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said to Rupanuga Virudhapa Siddhanta Danta Harane. So any Siddhanta that's different from that of Rupa Goswami, he takes exception to. So if they teach us that, and then we find nowadays, we have access to more texts than even many of the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur had access to. For example, the Sandarbhas of Jiva Goswami, they're in Sanskrit. I mean, I suppose they are there in Bengali and Hindi, but at the same time, they were at that time, but the availability of such books, I mean, what Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was doing with the printing press was novel. Now the digital books and so forth, so the extent to which these literatures, these texts are available is considerable. Many of the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta never studied the Sandarbhas. They studied the works that Bhaktisiddhanta gave them. And his main work was to reproduce the works of Bhakti Vinod. He himself didn't write that much either. So there was a particular focus. There was also somewhat of an anti-intellectual focus in Gaudiya Vaishnavism under Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, with an emphasis on practice, and not and kind of, I want to say, trying to ward off this this possibility of intellectualizing Gaudiya Vaishnavism and misconstruing that to be synonymous with realization of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He saw that was going on, and he was militating Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur against that. Shreya, what is that? Shreya Shrutim Gyane Prayasya Udapasya Namanta Eva Gyan Shunya Bhakti. Sridhara said to me several times, whenever I have intelligent devotees come, I have to emphasize on this point: Gyan Shunya Bhakti, Gyan Shunya Bhakti, Gyan Shunya Bhakti. So they don't just get caught up in their intellect. I think they've gone somewhere. So that was an emphasis in Gaudiya Math. And we find it to some extent in Prabhupada's work in ISKCON as well. And as a result, they weren't familiar with some of the texts. Pujapad Sridhar said he never read Ujjval Nilamani, for example, an important book of Rupa Goswami dealing with Madhurya Rasa. The implication would be that you don't have to read Ujjval Nilamani necessarily to realize Krishna in Madhurya Rasa. That makes sense. But it could be helpful at the same time if it was you're properly guided in it, and so on and so forth. So when Sridhar said, I didn't read this book or that book, that doesn't mean we should throw those books away. Therefore, we don't have to necessarily. I'll give you an example of what I'm speaking about here further. Sridhar told us that Bhaktisiddhanta did not allow his disciples to read Antya Leela of Chaitanya Charitamrita and Ramananda Samvad, which comes in the Madhya Leela. Ramananda Samvad was the favorite part of Chaitanya Charitamrita on the part of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. So obviously he read it. But Bhaktisiddhanta didn't allow them. At a certain point, he emphasized that. At a later point, Sridhar Maharaj, based on his realization, understood why he emphasized that at that time and the purpose behind it, and not being affected by Niyamagraha, not knowing the purpose. He entered into the Ramananda Samvad, and it was something he liked to recite and repeat and so forth. And he also drew from Antya Leela of Chaitanya Charitamrita readily in his discourse. So similarly, Sridhar Maharaj, for example, I'm saying he didn't read Ujjval Nilamani. I don't think he really studied the Sandarbhas at length either. He certainly didn't draw upon them in ways that other people have studied the Sandarbhas have done. That's an interesting point, because Gorkashras Babaji Maharaj told Bhaktisiddhanta to study the Sandarbhas and maybe publish them or something like that. But he was busy with the work of Bhakti Vinod Thakur primarily. So I think that there are some aspects, a couple only, of the teaching. You mentioned maybe anadi karma and whether bhakti is inherent in the jiva. These are the only two that stand out in my mind. That Bhakti Vinod talked about differently than in the Sandarbhas for reasons of his own. And I think that they has something to do with the nature of his preaching work that he was doing, interfacing with people. You take Anadi Karma, that makes no sense to Western theologians. They just think you're not answering the question. That's what they think. Why people are suffering in the world. India doesn't deal with, in Hindu philosophy, this doesn't, there are questions in Western theology that just, they aren't questions in Hinduism. No beginning to the world. No beginning to karma. It doesn't really compute. But the scripture says, I'm here to tell you about things that you couldn't know otherwise. This is something, Anadi. Just leave it at that, beginningless. Okay. It's very beautiful if you enter into it. The implications of it logically are like mind-boggling. I won't go into all that, but Bhakti Vinod talked about it a little bit differently, in a way that placed more overt emphasis on the jiva in terms of its plight, and removing emphasis on God having any fault, which is what what's the word? It's a theological argument. Theodicy is all about why people are suffering if God is all good, and so forth. So, of course, if you understand the Nadi Karma properly, it places emphasis on the jiva. It's just that you have no beginning. That's all. But every day you're making the wrong choices, and when you choose sense objects for the pleasure of your senses rather than for the pleasure of Bhagawan, and there are reactions. Every day you're doing it, so you're responsible. He's not responsible. But it has no beginning. Yeah, but a lot of things have no beginning. You have no beginning. The worlds have no beginning. So on and so forth. So creation is a leela. It's a play. There is no creation. There is no beginning. So anyway, Bhakti Vinod, I think he softened this a little bit. He tried to, in the way he talked about it. And for other reasons, he talked about bhakti being inherent. And I think relative to the preaching that he was doing. So that said, these ideas were passed along to the Pujapa Sridhar Maharaj, for example. He repeated them, and I now doing what I think he expected of me, and Prabhupada expected of me, taking what they have said, what they have written, and as a result, becoming interested in Krishna. I look at anything that's written about Krishna. I'm not afraid to look at somebody else's translation. I look at their translation. I think I have the depth of experience to be able to determine whether that's actually the Siddhanta or not. Or so I can read a scholar's book and I can find he makes a nice point, good, and then the rest of the article I can throw out. It's a waste of time. But anyway, I went through it, found one good point. My time was well spent. So I think they expect me to be like this. That's how I am. So if in the context of that, I find, Guru Maharaj, something you have said here, what would I do if he was here? I would say, Guru Maharaj, you said this, but over here, Jiva Goswami is saying this. Look, here it is. This is being said. This is the logic of that, and so forth. Well, I've already explained what his nature was, right? That he was not adverse to other opinions. Let's hear them. Let's get to what the truth of it is. So I also saw Prabhupada change his mind on things when he got other information. I'll give you a simple example. when we were young, at one point in Los Angeles, we decided to try to sell books in the airport because there were people from all over the world there. It was illegal, but so we changed from our devotional dress into secular clothing, disguised ourselves, so to speak, and went out and, with books in suitcases and moved around and tried to sell books. This is how book distribution in the airports in the United States began. And Kirtanananda Swami, who was living in West Virginia in New Vrindavan, he heard about this and he wrote to Prabhupada and he said, in Los Angeles, the devotees are becoming hippies again, and wearing ordinary clothes and so forth. I mean, he knew what we were doing, but for some reason, he did that. So Prabhupada wrote to us and said, immediately this should be stopped. Again, you're becoming hippies. This is not good. So then we had to write Prabhupada and say, Prabhupada, actually, that's not what's happening here. This is what's happening. We're doing it like this for this reason and so forth. And as soon as we can get these clothes off, we get them off. And we're back in our, devotional uniforms, happily dancing before the deity and so forth. So when Prabhupada got new information, he changed his opinion. He wrote about it in the Bhagavatam and in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He gave two examples, Prahlad, and how Nard came in an undercover way or something like that, was preaching to Hiranyakasipu's wife, but he was actually preaching to Prahlad or something. And in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the son of Tripurari Maharaj disguised and was dressed up by Sarvabhauma as a Vaishnav, and then Mahaprabhu embraced him. And then it was thought, oh, Tripurari Maharaj has been embraced because his son has been embraced. Prabhupada used, these are not good examples, but Prabhupada used them. So sometimes Vaishnavas, they disguise themselves for their purposes. And so he's trying to find a pramana in the scripture for this. And he stretched it and he wrote, that's what he wrote. And so sometimes our devotees are disguising themselves in order to go and sell a book and so forth. And he was seeking a pramana in the scripture. And so he changed his opinion. And then he supported that opinion. He looked for support in the scripture, and then he wrote about it. So I have my experience of them, of Prabhupada changing his opinion. Obviously, it wasn't a point of Siddhanta, but he took it like it was Siddhanta. He felt like we should be wearing the Vaishnavas should be dressed like this. We were all living in temple at that time. We were all, brahmacharis or brahmachari householders or whatever. And I didn't have the same experience with Sridhar Maharaj, but I did have experience of his, as I read, his openness and his willingness to discuss and so forth. So, what would I do if if they were here? I would explain it to them, and I'm sure they would agree. I have no doubt that they would agree. And then look at it like, yes, Bhaktivinoda is preaching like this, and whether that preaching has validity now or not, or whether it still has shelf life, as preaching strategies only have certain shelf life, they would agree. I mean, you sometimes people say, what would Prabhupada say? I would say, ask me. What would Prabhupada say if he's here now? Ask me, or somebody else who you accepted as your guru now. That's where you're going to find out. So if there are preaching strategies baked into the Sampradaya, I don't think necessarily Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj thought of it like that. I'm giving a preaching strategy, but I think he just repeated what Bhaktivinoda Thakur had said about it. And it wasn't a big topic necessarily. One of the ways this topic inherency of the jiva, of bhakti in the jiva comes up, of course. The way this came up in Gaudiya Math was always in relation to persons in other lineages who were more or less selling Siddha Pranali, Siddha Dehas. Come to me, and I'm in the Nityananda, Vamsa, family, the bloodline of Nityananda, and you should be prepared to drink my urine if you want to go back to Godhead. Come to me, and I will give you the Siddha Deha, and then you support me. This kind of thing was going on. So whenever this argument comes up in Gaudiya Math, even today you'll find contemporary persons, oh, they're saying bhakti is inherent. That means there's a sahajas. They think that so that's how that was being used by Bhakti Vinod. This is evidence that it was a preaching strategy on his part. You don't have to go there, it's in you. You don't have to go to them, it's in you. You do bhakti, you need sadhusanga. He consistently emphasized you need sadhusanga, you need sadhusanga. Without that, you can't get bhakti. But the same time, bhakti is inside of you, and it will come out naturally. The guru doesn't own it, and you have to buy it from him, and so forth. So he was really preaching against this kind of a thing, and that's how it was used also in Gaudiya Math or thought about. Then that you go down the line, and it starts to be, if you think that bhakti is inherent, that means you think this. No, we don't think all those other things. We don't think you have to drink my urine to become Krishna conscious. No, we don't think like that. But so that it gets distorted over time. So I think that they passed that along in the time, perhaps when they were younger and preaching. It was more of an issue in relation to sahajiyas or persons who were imitative or that's a broad term, that the way Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur used it, sahajiyas. But they came in touch with that. So I think they used that. By the time I met Sridhar Maharaj, it wasn't much of an issue, but he repeated the point. So anyway, to make a long answer shorter here, that's how I've harmonized it. I have no doubt whatsoever they would agree with me. Otherwise, I will. And I think I've explained why I feel like that for good reason. So, is there anything else?
There were some questions in the chat. One was in Spanish.
So, the question is about that I said we were teaching us more how to think than what to think. And can I comment on more on that and what would be an example of that? Well, Prabhupada wanted he used to use the term, what did he say? Now the term escapes me. The essence of it was independent thinkers, he wanted original thinkers, independent thinkers. I think that the emphasis here is that, as I said earlier, you have to use your intelligence in spiritual life. And there's sometimes an unwillingness to do that. And it can be troublesome because it involves, it results in growth, which can be painful at the onset. So I think in a broader sense, the idea is that spiritual life is not just 108 answers to 108 questions. It's outside, it's beyond the book and so forth. And you can, there's a saying, it's like, you have to do the dance that you've been shown by everyone you've ever known. And in the end, there is a dance you'll do alone. So we have to take these teachings and make them our own, if you will. And that doesn't mean to change the teachings, but that they have that much room within them. and one of the ways in which we progress is through mercy, and the other is through effort. So we do have to make an effort to get more mercy, more grace, no doubt. But we have to make an effort to internalize the teachings within the parameter, know what they are, within the parameters of them, make them our own. We have to, I refer to the Goswami's books as an outline or a table of contents. And I've often said, one of the pages in there is blank, but it's got your name on it, on a Purnadasi, and then you have to fill it in. Now, that's not something you can do in earlier stages, perhaps of bhakti as much as in later stages, but to know in earlier stages that that's there is useful. There has been a strong emphasis, and for good reason, on not thinking, and just practicing and so forth. But if that practicing is proper, it is going to cause you to start to think in a spiritual way. So it's really, what's an example you want to know of how to think rather than what to think? Well, I think we're talking about it here in the question of Padmanabha Maharaj. What to think? Bhakti is in your heart. Now how to think? Yeah, but that's not what's said by the founding acharyas, and it's said here. Why? How to think? Well, maybe because of this. No, that doesn't work. Maybe it's a preaching strategy. What was the context? What did Bhaktivinoda say at the time, and why? That's more like how to think than what to think. Of course, through the how to thinking, you arrive at what to think in a bigger sense. So what I'm really saying is that you have to use your intelligence is also going to be taxed, and this is relevant to attaining nishta. Nishta. If you nishta, you have to learn how to think to be a nishta. It's not just learning a bunch of verses and cutting off your genitals, but that's not what nishta is about. Some repression. And then you mechanically go through all these motions and learn verses and chant and so forth. You're becoming a nasta prayeshu abhadreshu nityam bhagavata seva. You're becoming a thinking person. What is the person of Vyas? What is he? Is he a thinking person? Clearly. So it's not so easy how to think, I admit, but that's part of the challenge before us. Now, a lot of people, I say this, and they try to do the how to think, and they start thinking outside of the parameters of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and that's not how to think either. So at some point, it's more what to think than how to think. So what else?
There's another question. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I see a question by Tamal. He says, today you have said, nothing is more confirming for our faith than consistent experience of trans-psychological emotions or bhavavas. Can you say more about this, especially if Srila Sridhar Maharaj gave any instructions about such bhavavas practice in a sadhana bhakti stage? Tamal Krishna Das. Well, I'm not speaking about this in terms of how to practice bhavavas. There is something to be said about that, I think, but I'm speaking about having the abhas of the trans-psychological emotions themselves, the ecstasy of that, which gives some experiential sense that what is of what is to be attained is like. So the ecstasy of it of all. Obviously, we are uncovering ourselves, Cetodarpana Marjanam, with the broom of bhakti. But because we're uncovering ourselves, we're not experiencing only Atmananda, but some semblance, at least, of Bhakti Ananda. That's what we call Bhavabhas. So, I mean, Rupa Goswami gives the example. At a festival, there's all day long, there's hearing, there's chanting, there's prasadam, there's discourse, and somebody just gets absorbed in it and comes away and says, that was ecstatic. And they experience something that they never experienced before, waves of bliss. And so, all these are simple examples of Bhavabhas. So they're very confirming what you're speaking about, practicing Bhava as an Abhas. I think there's something to be said for that also, but that is different from what I was speaking about. But to go into that in a little bit, at least, for devotees who understand with their intellect properly the Siddhanta with regard to the Prayojan, and understand and have an interest in that. Like you take, for example, Bhaktivedanta Narayan Maharaj, your guru, Tamal Krishna Maharaj, or Tamal Krishna Das. When I spoke to him about Sakyarasa, he wanted to hear from me if I really knew what I was talking about, anything about it, or whether it was just some sentence. So when I could reply, and he could see that I understood what I was talking about philosophically, then he would respond to it differently, rather than trying to close it down, which he would for some others, for example, or if they said they liked Nrsingadev, or something like that, they wanted to be a blade of grass or whatever. He just closed that down and talk about Manjari Bhav. But if persons could respond and he could see that they understood, then he would respond in a different way. And I had a conversation when he visited me once, and I had an ashram in Oregon, one of the states just north of us here in California, and in private with him. And then the next morning he went on a walk, and we went on, and he was talking, and we came along. There was a park there, and there was a river and nice trees. It's very beautiful here. And I said, Ami Jamuna Puline, Kadamba Kanane. He liked that. And so then he began to speak about the river as it was the Jamuna. And then he turned to me and said something about, he started talking about Dinakasura Lila, and he turned to me and said, say something about that. I was startled that he too startled to say anything, and then he spoke something. But of course, Dinakasura Lila is central to Gopastami and so on and so forth. So point being that if someone is fully acquainted or well acquainted with the teaching and has an ideal that has developed, that they have a corresponding understanding of scripturally, then that person has some scope for practicing bhav, which is kind of what you're talking about, the practice of bhavabhas. I mean, it's not talked about in that way, but basically what one would do there, of course, is make this ideal now the center of one's practice. It becomes the center of one's practice. And cherishing that ideal appropriately, internally, cherishing that ideal, idealizing it, this becomes the prominent feature of one's practice. You have to understand that the ideal of Madhurya Ras, Sakya Ras, whatever may be the case, these embodiments of this are so dear to Krishna. I mean, they correspond with who Krishna is. There is no, cowherd friend Krishna without Sridham. There's no, without Radha, there's no, there's no Krishna in Braj. So his very form is made of the Swarup Shakti, that they are constituted of. This is the beta equation, obviously. So they are so dear to him that if you idealize what they represent, and that idealization of that is accurate philosophically, and you know where you're at the same time. Like I often say, if you go into a mall shopping center, they have a map and says, you want to go to room 108, it's over here. And it also says, and you are here. You got to know where to go and where you are. Both these things well thought out so that you know where you're going, and then you know where to step next. So if you've got that figured out, and then in the context of that, you're idealizing that, this is very endearing to Krishna. In other words, you want something, and you actually know what you want. It's not just a sentiment. It's grounded in revelation and so forth. Then, I mean, who wants that? What does Krishna say to the gopis in Kurukshetra? What is the verse? Mayi bhakti ribhutanam amritan vaya kalpate. Mayi bhakti ribhutanam amritat vaya kalpate. People approach me for all kinds of things. They want things. They want to get away from things. They maybe want to worship me, because I'm supposed to be worshipped. But you go because what you want, that I don't know how to think about that. That has completely captured me entirely. I'm purchased by that. These other people, they want something about me or something I have. Oh, I give it. Okay, yatamam prapadyante tam sataiva bhajamyaham. As they approach, so I respond. But the way you're approaching, I can't respond to that in kind. I'm purchased by it, captured. So if we idealize that accurately, appropriately, with a humble heart, at the thought of the prospect, this is very compelling. You get Krishna's attention. You want that, and you've understood it. You thought, So this is central then. Baba Mai, and Baba Sambandhi. Then you do those practices that are in relation to that Baba Mai, with that in mind. And your practice will become focused and so forth. And so this is something along the lines, I think, of what you're asking about. What did Pujapad Sridhar say about that? I can't think of anything at the moment, but I hope that answers somewhat.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Maharaj.
Hare Krishna. Okay. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Where are you now?
Nice to be seen by you.
Where are you? Where are you now?
I'm in the new Goloka temple in Hillsborough, North Carolina, renting a little house in the forest next to the temple.
Nice.
Renting a room.
We have some devotees there. Yeah.
Yeah, many good friends here.
Good. Nice to see you.
Radhe Shyam.
So anything else?
I don't see anything in the chat right now, but
Okay, well, let me just quickly address the question about the hexagonal, the geometric depiction of Golok, if you will, hexagon inside of a square. I'm going to give a very brief answer. The question is about how the Gopal mantra was it inscribed in there or something like that? It's basically just one word from your syllable from word from each of the mantra is placed in the different sections of the hexagon. So I mean, what it is a sonic geometric representation of Goloka. So it's meant to be an aid to help us understand the implications of the mantra. I don't, these yantras, if you will, are not, they're drawn from the Tantra. They're not, they don't seem to be as much in vogue as aids at the present time as they were in the past. But I've written about it in my forthcoming book also. So hopefully you'll be able to draw a more comprehensive insight from that. And we're running out of time here quite a bit. We're way over time. I'm sorry for that. So thank you all. Pujapad Bhakti Rakshak Sridhara Swami Maharaj ki jai. Lord Bhakti Vrinda ki jai. Guru Premanande. Haribo.
Thank you. Let me stop the recording and I'll make the announcements for the classes coming up this week. That was such a nice class.